We're pretty accustomed to scams over here on the channel, but nothing has quite amazed or left me so quite confused as this. So, for those of you that are actually able to read the title, you'll probably have a good idea what we're actually taking a look at today. This here is a package from China, apparently containing my new used genuine Ryzen 7 Pro 3000, which was tested perfect work, and has arrived all the way from China, or Hong Kong, or Taiwan. The listing really can't make its wind up where it actually came from. Costed me just shy of €35, or well £32, because for some reason the seller has listed all of their items solely for sale in euros, not the usual pound or dollar they usually opt for. You get how strange this all is, but what exactly is in the box? It does actually seem like they've tried to replicate some sort of authentic experience, at least to a certain extent, because it comes in a nice big cardboard box, which contains plenty of bubble wrap, 2 separate layers in fact, which is a good choice given that AMD CPUs are meant to have pins on them. But anyway, the further we got into the box, the worse things actually ended up looking. It became quite clear to me that the box it was actually shipped in was going to be the most premium thing about this. They've opted to use what seems to be an off-cut of anti-static packaging, all wrapped up with elastic bands, which ended up holding the remnants of the packaging, namely our Ryzen 7 3000 Pro. And here it is, the CPU itself, the Ryzen 7 3000, the abomination that we've all come to see. I was amazed to see that it is actually AM4, but I wish I could tell you what CPU they were actually using, but I can't see anything at all because they've sanded the bloody thing down. Most likely so you won't know what you're actually getting, as it is AM4 so you'd expect it to just work. I can just about make out the AMD naming on there, but nothing that might actually be useful to identify it. So I suppose the only thing is to find out what it boots up to. By removing my real Ryzen 7 3000, we're actually going to stick this in my system real quick to find out what's going on and what they've actually sent us. So at first the system wouldn't post, and that was a bit strange, so I decided to reset the CMOS battery, and suddenly the CPU was detected by the system. However, the reason it didn't work immediately was actually because my RAM was too good, because see, this isn't actually a Ryzen CPU at all, despite it using AM4. This right here, although named the Ryzen 7 3000 Pro, is not a Ryzen 7 3000 Pro, as that's a workstation CPU released only in certain markets. It is, however, a real working AM4 processor. It just so happens to be one of the most useless ones out there right now. It is the AMD Athlon 2X4950, one of AMD's old Athlons rebadged to work on the latest AM4 socket, with this one being released around 4 years ago in 2016 to lukewarm reviews. It was one of the cheapest new AMD CPUs out there that wasn't an APU, and is essentially an older FM2 Athlon that runs with up to 2400 MHz of DDR4 RAM. The reason it didn't immediately post is because my RAM runs higher than this with the normal Ryzen processor. It also has no L3 cache at all, can only boost to a measly 3.8 GHz, which is pretty low considering what these things are meant to clock to, but honestly, for a cheap processor from 4 years ago, I'm more amazed we got something that was even AM4 based, as if you were going to fall for something, I'd imagine you'd likely fall for something that actually fits in the socket you expect it to. Anyway, you can't check the names or specs by looking at it, you'd only see that faint AMD logo and assume you got a bit of a bargain. That is of course provided you don't know enough about computers to actually fall for one of these. Still, these things have long since been replaced by much better low-end Ryzen CPUs like the 200GE, which end up costing about the same as these, meaning that these CPUs are incredibly hard to shift because no one wants to buy them. Why buy these if you could buy a dual-core Ryzen that's just better than it? Hence why they are likely being sanded down and sold on under a different name, just to get rid of them at this point. We're going to be chucking this into my main system, and honestly, I really don't know what to expect. My friend had the FM2 variant of this processor, and it got to the stage where an old i5 was just a much snappier and all-around better experience, so he moved to an 1155 i5. But it'll be interesting to see how this little fake CPU will hold up against 2020. It's got the best chance going for it, being paired with 32GB of RAM clocked in at 2400 MHz, the highest it'll go, and my usual AMD Fury, which is way more than capable of testing this little hunk of metal. But anyways, let's get right into it. I will say first though that the CPU usage on boot up really spiked incredibly high, pegging the system at 100%, and it did struggle for a little while. But I'll touch more on the day-to-day usage of the CPU later on in the video, as primarily we want to actually see how this thing holds up in some games. I can stress though that usage did go down after a little bit, so you are seeing solely game performance here, and I reckon it'll surprise some of you. So first of all, a big thank you to Merlin who actually bought me this fantastic game to test, where in BeamNG we saw a very playable and surprisingly high frame rate of 79 FPS. In fact, my only criticism was the lack of L3 cache causing some very high load times in a game like this, where really, you know, this CPU is being stressed very hard just to get things to load in because there are a lot of little assets going on. Either way, was really surprised with this one, but this is a best case scenario. A game that's more of a simulation and targets all of those 4 cores pretty damn well. All in all though, it was a very good experience, although the FPS could tank a little bit when you were in the heavier scenes of the game. It was never enough to make things unplayable on the CPU though, and all in all a very good experience when all cores are used. CSGO did not actually run as well as I'd hoped it did, but then again, this was one of the main reasons my friend actually moved away from these old Athlons to a Sandy Bridge i5 when he was stuck with an Athlon on FM2. It was definitely playable, but the game just felt incredibly sluggish. I know it's a lot harder to run now than it used to be, but even with lower settings benchmarking this CPU, it just can't hit any high frame rates at all, and most of the time you want high FPS in a game like CSGO. I ran through a couple of casual games as usual, as they are quite intensive, and we didn't see a great experience at all. Definitely playable, but nowhere near as good as a real Ryzen CPU, and likely an area where you'd be likely feeling that old FX experience again, just this time a bit worse as it isn't an FX, it's an Athlon. GTA 5 did actually perform okay with lower settings. Higher settings like shadows and reflections would cause the frame rate to tank down to PS3 levels, so I decided to stick with standard settings when I was benchmarking this CPU, and it did actually run okay, up until we saw something very reminiscent of the older FM2 Athlons, and a few older dual cores as well. It's an old issue that some of you will likely remember, that the lack of cache causes the world to load in around you if you just started the game and travelling quite fast. Now don't get me wrong, that does go away after you play the game for a little bit, but it's just one of those fun old issues that you end up seeing on those older processors, which is what this essentially is. Halo is a perfectly optimized game and stuck to a locked 60 FPS. As I've noticed, this game does actually have some issues when you unlock the frame rate, so I was more about keeping this experience as smooth as possible by keeping it locked to 60. And honestly, considering this is a console game that was utilizing a CPU that is probably way weaker than this is, I'm not all too surprised to see it running so well here. But either way, if you didn't know anything about processors, you could see yourself being caught out with the game running this well on what you bought as a £30 processor. Now, for a modern 2020 release, I've put this game down as running poorly, as I was using fairly mediocre settings that would run on most, if not all, Ryzen processors. And maybe this was a little bit tough on this old CPU, but depending on the instance, the game could run either absolutely fine with a near solid 30 to 40 FPS, or it could tank down to a slideshow. I was speaking with some people though and thought I'd do a bit of a deep dive into how this game works, and how the game actually runs. And we found out that shadows in this game hammer cores 0 and 1, and given this processor's lack of any real cache, it causes the performance to suffer greatly, meaning very sporadic performance depending on what shadows were actually needed in what battle you were playing at. So something that you can solve with very low settings, but considering we were sold this as a Ryzen, not a great showing all around. Civilization 6 ran well in terms of frame rate. However, utilising the game's own built-in benchmarks showed that as the game progressed, it could take quite some time for your turns to be processed. Now, don't get me wrong, this is actually pretty impressive, and I'd imagine the DirectX 12 API helped spread the load across all the cores, hence why we're actually seeing some pretty respectable performance. Either way, in terms of performance, it was very stable, but loading is definitely an issue, being quite troublesome when you're actually trying to get into a game. And with the time it actually took for the actual benchmark to load, I'd imagine it'd be significantly higher if you're loading a very late game save on this game. Finally, it goes without saying that for any easier older to run titles like Black Mesa Source, which is an easier to run title, but still very recent and a very good game, it is way more than adequate running on this processor, and is likely where you'd be caught out, as not everyone's always playing the latest and greatest games, and these Athlons really don't seem to struggle with anything before their release date, at least not too badly, with a lot of those retro or indie titles running really great on this processor, which is exactly where you'll find yourself noticing very little differences between this and a real Ryzen CPU. Now those gaming benchmarks were definitely impressive, and I'm frankly amazed at how well a cashless Athlon is holding up in 2020. However, although it succeeded in games, in general usage is really where the poor thing was just falling down. It was completely hammered hard, where a Ryzen CPU simply just doesn't struggle. Now the general snappiness I'm used to with a Zen or Zen 2 based CPU is simply out of this world compared to this old turd architecture that we saw last from AMD before we had Ryzen. It saw a lot of programs opening picking usage at 100%, and in itself it would cause you to stall and wait for everything to be loaded in. It's been a while since I've used Windows 10 and had to wait for Task Manager to be dragged around the screen. And your CPU, once it does catch up and you've waited for it, is actually okay. But it's a prime example on where you would notice a difference, because AMD has simply blown their old processors out of the ballpark because Ryzen's that good, and these old ones, although they're okay, you really notice the difference in day-to-day usage. People have kept requesting me to start testing Cinebench, which is something that I don't often do as I usually opt for 3D Mark. However, do what you will with these results. All in all, running both tests probably took me near 40 minutes to actually achieve, but the score is on screen now, so if you really want to compare all this against another CPU, please feel free. The same holds true for 3D Mark, which is my preferred CPU test, where we saw that the CPU really showed its weakness compared to any real modern AMD processor, where honestly, it goes to show that first gen Ryzen has fallen so much in price, and you just don't need an older AMD CPU unless it's a Ryzen one. It would, however, be unfair to buy a Ryzen 7 3000 Pro, or whatever they're actually calling this, without comparing it to some real Ryzen processors, at least in some titles, and to put into perspective just how far we've actually come from these very low-end Athlon processors. Because even on the low end we can see here, Ryzen is simply just better than their old school architectures. And I know which one I'd rather be going after. In case anyone wanted some more pointless information, I have also got a graph that compares it to a Pentium D. Not that anyone really needs to see this, but hey, if you wanted to see it beat something, it can beat an old Pentium D. Honestly though, gaming performance really surprised me, and it was way more than adequate. It was just slow at general usage, it wasn't very snappy, and loading things in to actually play them took a long time. All of my tests were performed the exact same regardless of the processor, with the exact same specifications and storage medium, and the Athlon just spends a lot of time loading, where newer Zen processors, even on the low end, just don't. Which is something you may actually end up noticing if you were scammed by this processor. So there we have it, the new Ryzen scam. And honestly, I think it's kind of admirable just how lazy this one is. They didn't bother editing any microcode or whatever they could have actually attempted to do to make this actually seem like a Ryzen processor. Nope, this is very literally just a sanded down Athlon that has been boxed up and crudely sold under another name. I mean, I'm impressed as it's not terrible price for this little Athlon, but once again, I'd imagine there's a reason these are all surplus stock. Because there's no reason to buy one, because there are low-end AMD Zen processors which are just better to buy. However, this is obscure, dumb, and frankly lazy, and this was the latest in processor scams. And I'd like to thank you all for watching, I hope you found it quite interesting. Good night. So there we have it, just another little fun scam for you guys. Still, if you want to see more like this, you can always like and subscribe for more, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.